In the shadow chambers of medieval Europe, mothers prepared what they believed was nourishment for their infants. They took stale bread, soaked it in ale or wine, and placed this mixture into the mouths of babies barely old enough to swallow. This wasn't cruelty or ignorance. It was considered proper child care, recommended by physicians and practiced across social classes for centuries. The medieval approach to infant feeding reveals a world where survival took precedence over what we now understand as proper nutrition. Between the 12th and 15th centuries, European parents faced a fundamental challenge: how to keep their children alive in an era when clean water was scarce, milk could carry disease, and medical knowledge was built on theories that seemed alien to modern understanding. The practice of feeding babies bread soaked in alcoholic beverages emerged from this harsh reality, supported by medical texts, religious teachings, and generations of accumulated wisdom that prioritized immediate survival over long-term health. Medieval physicians operated within a framework of humoral theory, inherited from ancient Greek medicine and refined by Islamic scholars. According to this system, all substances possessed inherent qualities of hot, cold, wet, or dry, and proper health required maintaining balance among these elements. Bread was considered warm and dry, making it suitable for strengthening weak constitutions. Wine and ale were classified as warm substances that could aid digestion and provide vital heat to developing bodies. The most influential medical texts of the period, including works by Avicenna and Bartholomeus Anglicus, specifically addressed infant care. These manuscripts, copied by hand and distributed among educated physicians, contain detailed instructions for preparing infant food. The 13th century text, De Proprietatibus Rerum, explicitly recommended bread soaked in wine for babies who could not nurse, describing the mixture as easily digestible and strengthening to weak stomachs. Medieval medical practitioners believed that infants possessed naturally cold and moist temperaments, requiring warm, dry foods to achieve proper balance. This theoretical foundation provided scientific justification for practices that modern medicine would consider harmful. The alcohol content was not seen as problematic, but rather as medicinally beneficial, capable of warming the child's constitution and preventing the accumulation of cold humors that were thought to cause illness. The medieval world lacked understanding of waterborne pathogens, yet practical experience had taught people that drinking water often led to illness. Wells could become contaminated with human waste, animal carcasses, or runoff from workshops and tanning operations. Rivers served multiple purposes: transportation routes, waste disposal systems, and sources of drinking water, creating conditions that modern sanitation science recognizes as extremely hazardous. Alcoholic beverages offered a safer alternative. The brewing process naturally eliminated many harmful microorganisms, though medieval people understood this only through observation rather than scientific knowledge. They recognized that people who drank ale or wine were less likely to develop certain illnesses compared to those who relied primarily on water. This practical wisdom, combined with the ready availability of low-alcohol beverages, made them the preferred liquid for preparing infant food. Archaeological evidence from medieval settlements reveals the ubiquity of brewing operations. Even modest households maintained basic facilities for producing ale, while wine was available through trade networks across Europe. These beverages were often consumed by entire families, including children, as part of daily nutrition rather than recreational drinking. The alcohol content of medieval ale was typically much lower than modern beer, usually ranging between 2 and 4%, making it closer to what we might consider a nutritional beverage rather than an intoxicant. Wealthy families could employ wet nurses, women who had recently given birth and could provide breast milk for another child. This practice was extensively documented in household accounts, legal contracts, and medical treatises. However, wet nursing came with its own set of complications that made bread and alcohol feeding seem like a reasonable alternative for many families. Finding a suitable wet nurse required careful screening. Medieval medical texts warned about the importance of the nurse's temperament, diet, and moral character, believing these qualities would transfer to the child through her milk. The 12th century physician Trotula wrote extensively about selecting wet nurses, emphasizing that they should be healthy, of good character, and maintain proper diet. Families feared that a wet nurse's vices or illnesses would contaminate their child through her milk. Economic factors also limited access to wet nursing. A wet nurse commanded significant wages and required housing, food, and medical care. For merchant families and lower nobility, the cost could represent a substantial portion of household income. Additionally, wet nurses were often shared among multiple families or were unreliable, leaving parents to seek alternative feeding methods when their services were unavailable. But wet nursing raised deeper concerns about social boundaries and child development. Medieval society placed enormous importance on bloodline and inheritance, and there were persistent fears that prolonged contact with a wet nurse might somehow alter a child's fundamental nature. These anxieties, combined with practical limitations, drove many families toward artificial feeding methods. The choice of bread for infant feeding involved careful consideration of grain types, preparation methods, and aging. Medieval medical texts specified that white bread made from wheat was preferable for infants, as it was considered more refined and easier to digest than bread made from barley, rye, or oats. However, wheat bread was expensive and not available to all social classes, leading to adaptations based on family resources. The bread used for infant feeding was typically several days old, having lost much of its moisture and developed a firmer texture that would hold together when soaked. Fresh bread was considered too soft and liable to disintegrate completely when mixed with liquid, making it difficult for infants to consume. The aging process also concentrated the grain's nutritional content, making it more suitable for developing digestive systems. Regional variations in bread preparation affected infant feeding practices across Europe. In areas where rye was the dominant grain, parents adapted the alcohol soaking method to work with darker, denser breads. Mediterranean regions with access to refined wheat flour produced white bread that was considered ideal for infant consumption. These regional differences created distinct approaches to the same basic feeding principle, demonstrating how local resources shaped childcare practices. Archaeological analysis of medieval bread remains reveals the complex composition of these grain products. Many contained additional ingredients like beans, peas, or other legumes, creating more nutritionally complete foods than simple grain breads. When these composite breads were soaked in alcoholic beverages, they provided a broader range of nutrients than might initially appear, though still lacking many elements essential for proper infant development. The specific alcoholic beverages used for infant feeding varied based on availability, cost, and perceived medical benefits. Wine held the highest status among medieval physicians, who attributed numerous healing properties to different varieties. Red wine was thought to strengthen blood and provide vital heat, while white wine was considered better for delicate constitutions. Medical treatises categorized wines according to their regional origins, with each type assigned specific therapeutic uses. Ale represented the more common choice for infant feeding among ordinary families. Produced from barley, oats, or wheat, ale was less expensive than wine and could be produced in household settings with basic equipment. The brewing process created a mildly alcoholic beverage that contained B vitamins and other nutrients from the grain, making it more nutritionally complete than plain water while providing the safety benefits of alcohol's antiseptic properties. Mead, made from fermented honey, appeared in some medical texts as particularly suitable for infant feeding. Honey was considered a pure, natural substance with healing properties, and the fermentation process created an alcoholic beverage thought to combine the benefits of honey's sweetness with alcohol's warming effects. However, mead was expensive and not readily available in all regions, limiting its use to wealthier families. Some regions developed specialized weak alcoholic beverages specifically for children and invalids. These products had lower alcohol content than regular ale or wine, but retained the safety advantages of fermentation. Historical records from monastery breweries indicate the production of these specialized beverages, suggesting that the practice of giving alcohol to children was systematic rather than casual. The application of bread and alcohol feeding varied significantly across social hierarchies, with each class adapting the practice according to their resources and circumstances. Aristocratic families could afford the finest white bread and imported wines, creating elaborate infant feeding preparations that demonstrated their status while following medical recommendations. Court records from noble households detail specific instructions given to nursemaids about proper bread selection and wine proportions. Merchant families occupied a middle ground, able to afford quality ingredients while lacking the extravagance of nobility. Their household accounts reveal purchases of specific types of bread and ale designated for infant care, showing that the practice required dedicated resources even among moderately wealthy families. These families often consulted with local physicians or followed written medical guides to ensure proper preparation methods. Peasant families adapted the practice using whatever resources were available to them. Dark bread made from mixed grains was soaked in weak ale or diluted wine, creating a feeding mixture that followed the same principles while reflecting economic limitations. Agricultural records suggest that even serf families maintained small brewing operations, specifically to provide safe beverages for their children, indicating the importance placed on this feeding method across all social levels. Urban craftsmen and laborers face unique challenges in obtaining suitable ingredients. City regulations control bread quality and alcohol sales, while higher prices made quality ingredients expensive. Guild records show that some craft organizations provided guidelines for members about infant feeding, suggesting that professional communities took collective responsibility for ensuring proper childcare practices among their members. The actual preparation of bread and alcohol feeding involved specific techniques passed down through generations of women. The bread was typically torn into small pieces rather than cut, as tearing was believed to preserve the grain's essential properties. These pieces were then arranged in wooden bowls or ceramic vessels, never in metal containers, which were thought to corrupt the food's natural qualities. The soaking process required careful timing and proportions. Medical texts recommended allowing the bread to absorb the liquid completely before offering it to the infant, creating a consistency similar to modern baby food. The mixture was tested by the mother or nursemaid to ensure proper temperature and texture, with adjustments made based on the child's age and apparent digestive capacity. Feeding sessions were scheduled around the household's daily rhythm, typically occurring 3 to 4 times per day. The infant was positioned carefully, often supported in an adult's lap or placed in specially designed feeding chairs that elevated the head to prevent choking. The alcohol-soaked bread was administered using carved wooden spoons or, in some cases, pieces of cloth that could be sucked. The preparation process included prayers and blessings, reflecting the spiritual dimension of childcare in medieval society. Parents believed that divine protection was necessary for successful child-rearing, and the feeding ritual incorporated religious elements alongside practical care. This combination of medical theory, practical necessity, and spiritual belief created a comprehensive approach to infant nutrition that served multiple psychological and social functions. Medieval medical texts acknowledge various complications that could arise from bread and alcohol feeding, though their understanding of causation differed significantly from modern medical knowledge. Physicians noted that some infants experienced digestive difficulties, sleeping problems, or failure to gain weight properly, but they typically attributed these issues to imbalances in the child's humoral constitution rather than the feeding method itself. The 14th century physician dietist Chauliac wrote extensively about infant feeding problems, describing symptoms that modern medicine would recognize as malnutrition, alcohol poisoning, or digestive disorders. However, his recommended treatments involved adjusting the proportions of bread and alcohol or changing the types of wine used rather than abandoning the feeding method entirely. This approach reflected the medieval tendency to refine practices rather than fundamentally questioning their validity. Some medical practitioners developed elaborate diagnostic methods for determining which infants could tolerate bread and alcohol feeding. They examined the child's complexion, sleeping patterns, and stool consistency to assess compatibility with different feeding mixtures. These observations led to personalized feeding protocols that varied the bread types, alcohol concentrations, and feeding schedules based on individual infant characteristics. Regional medical schools developed competing theories about optimal infant feeding practices, leading to scholarly debates that were recorded in medical commentaries and letters between physicians. These discussions revealed that medieval medical practitioners were genuinely concerned about infant welfare and actively sought to improve feeding methods within their theoretical framework, even when that framework was fundamentally flawed by modern standards. The medieval church played a significant role in shaping attitudes toward infant feeding practices, including the use of alcohol in baby food. Religious authorities generally supported the practice, viewing it as medically necessary and morally acceptable within the context of child survival. Theological writings emphasized that parents had a divine obligation to preserve their children's lives using whatever means were available and effective. Monastic communities, which maintained extensive medical knowledge and brewing operations, actively participated in developing infant feeding practices. Monastery infirmaries treated sick children and documented their observations about different feeding methods. The detailed records kept by religious communities provide some of the most comprehensive evidence about medieval infant care practices, including specific recipes and preparation instructions. Some religious authorities raised concerns about giving alcohol to children, but these objections typically focused on preventing excessive consumption rather than eliminating alcohol entirely. Church teachings emphasized moderation and proper purpose, distinguishing between medicinal use and recreational drinking. This moral framework allowed parents to feel confident that they were acting responsibly while following medical recommendations. The practice of blessing infant food became common in many regions, with priests providing special prayers for feeding mixtures. These blessings served both spiritual and practical purposes, offering divine protection while also ensuring that religious authorities monitored and approved feeding practices. The integration of religious and medical approaches created a comprehensive support system for medieval parents facing the challenges of infant care. Different regions of medieval Europe developed distinct approaches to bread and alcohol feeding based on local resources, climate conditions, and cultural preferences. Northern European countries, with their emphasis on ale production and heartier grain varieties, created feeding practices that reflected their brewing traditions and agricultural patterns. Archaeological evidence from Germanic regions shows specialized infant feeding vessels designed specifically for alcohol-soaked bread. Mediterranean areas adapted the practice to incorporate wine more extensively, taking advantage of established viticulture and trading networks. Italian and French medical texts describe elaborate feeding preparations using various wine types, often mixed with honey or other sweetening agents available through Mediterranean trade routes. These regional variations demonstrate how local resources shape the application of universal medical principles. Eastern European regions developed hybrid approaches that combined bread and alcohol feeding with other traditional infant care methods. Slavic communities integrated herbs and other plant materials into their feeding mixtures, creating more complex preparations that reflected their folk medicine traditions. These adaptations show how the basic concept of alcohol-based infant feeding was modified to fit different cultural contexts. Coastal regions with access to international trade could obtain specialized ingredients not available inland, leading to more elaborate feeding preparations among wealthy families. Port cities served as centers for exchanging information about infant care practices, with merchants and travelers sharing knowledge about successful feeding methods from different regions. This cultural exchange contributed to the evolution and refinement of bread and alcohol feeding practices across Europe. The gradual abandonment of bread and alcohol infant feeding occurred over several centuries, driven by changing medical understanding, improved water safety, and evolving social attitudes toward childcare. Renaissance medical texts began questioning some aspects of humoral theory, though the transition away from alcohol-based feeding was slow and uneven across different regions and social classes. The development of improved water purification methods and urban sanitation systems reduced the practical necessity for alcoholic beverages as safe liquid sources. As cities developed better wells and water distribution systems, parents gained access to alternatives that didn't require alcohol. However, this transition occurred primarily in urban areas, with rural communities continuing traditional practices much longer. New medical theories emerging from university centers began emphasizing different approaches to infant nutrition, though these changes initially affected only educated urban populations. The printing press allowed for wider distribution of updated medical texts, but traditional practices persisted in areas where literacy was limited or where access to new information was restricted. The Protestant Reformation contributed to changing attitudes toward alcohol consumption, including its use in infant feeding. While Catholic regions maintained more tolerant approaches, Protestant areas began developing stricter standards about giving alcohol to children. These religious changes combined with medical developments to accelerate the decline of traditional feeding practices. The medieval practice of feeding babies bread soaked in alcohol represents a complex intersection of medical theory, practical necessity, and cultural adaptation that shaped European childcare for centuries. While modern medical knowledge has revealed the dangers and inadequacies of this feeding method, Understanding its historical context provides insight into how societies adapt to challenges using available knowledge and resources. The documentation surrounding bread and alcohol feeding offers valuable evidence about medieval family life, medical practices, and social structures. These historical records reveal how parents across different social classes struggled with the fundamental challenge of keeping their children alive in difficult circumstances, using methods that made sense within their understanding of health and nutrition. The persistence of this practice across multiple centuries and regions demonstrates the power of established medical authority and traditional knowledge in shaping behavior. Even when individual families observed problems with their feeding methods, the combination of medical endorsement, practical necessity, and social acceptance maintained these practices until fundamental changes in knowledge and circumstances made alternatives possible. Modern historians and medical researchers continue to study medieval infant feeding practices to understand how medical knowledge develops and changes over time. These studies provide perspective on contemporary medical practices and remind us that future generations may view some of our current approaches with similar bewilderment. The medieval world's attempts to care for children, however flawed by modern standards, reflect a universal human commitment to protecting and nurturing the next generation within the constraints of available knowledge and resources. In the end, medieval parents who fed their babies bread soaked in alcohol were following the best medical advice of their time, using the safest available resources and applying centuries of accumulated wisdom to the eternal challenge of child survival. Their practices seem disturbing to modern sensibilities, but they emerge from the same fundamental drive that motivates parents today, the determination to give their children the best possible chance at life, regardless of the obstacles they face.